When most people think of goth music, they think of pale faces, black clothing, and bands like Bauhaus or Sisters of Mercy. But before goth had a name, before the subculture existed, and before anyone knew what gothic rock would become, there was Joy Division, a band so influential, nearly every dark alternative genre that followed would feel their impact. Today, we're going to talk about how Joy Division formed, who the members were, the music they created, and why four young men from Manchester accidentally helped shape the future of alternative music. To understand Joy Division, you have to understand more than just a city. You have to understand a feeling that existed there in the late 1970s. Manchester was industrial, but it wasn't thriving in industrial anymore. It was decay. Factories that once defined entire neighborhoods were shutting down. Whole streets were built around jobs that no longer existed. For younger people growing up in that environment, the future didn't feel open-ended. It felt like something was shrinking. There wasn't a lot of money. There wasn't a lot of movement. And there definitely wasn't a lot of optimism floating around. So for a lot of teenagers and young adults, music became the only real outlet that felt alive. At the same time, punk rock was exploding across the UK. But punk wasn't polished or controlled. It wasn't something that people studied. It was something that people did. It rejected skill. It rejected traditional musicianship. It rejected the idea that you needed to be trained or approved to make noise that mattered. That attitude hit Manchester at exactly the right time. On June 4th, 1976, the Sex Pistols played at the Lesser Free Trade Hall. The crowd was small, but the impact was massive. Among people watching were Bernard Sumner and Peter Hook. They didn't just enjoy the show, they left it thinking differently. That night became a turning point. They decided to form a band, not because they were ready, but because they realized nobody else was going to do it for them. They had no real technical background, no formal training, just energy, interest. Stephen Morris joined on drums and immediately changed the direction slightly. He was more controlled, more structured, more precise than typical punk drummers. Then Ian Curtis joined, and everything shifted again. Curtis wasn't coming from a punk mindset. He was reading literature, philosophy, poetry, thinking internally rather than externally. That contrast would become the foundation of the band's identity. They started under the name Warsaw. At first, their sound was still aggressive, still fast, still rooted in punk energy, but it didn't stay there for long. Something in the band kept pulling the sound downward, slower, heavier, more spacious, less about energy, more about atmosphere. Eventually, they renamed themselves Joy Division, and that name marked the beginning of something completely different. A lot of bands can be explained by a single dominant figure. Joy Division isn't one of them. Ian Curtis was the emotional center. His writing came from internal pressure rather than external commentary. He focused on isolation, anxiety, emotional distance, and psychological fragmentation. His lyrics often feel like someone trying to translate thoughts that don't fully make sense even to themselves. On stage, he became known for his unpredictable movement, sharp gestures, sudden shifts in posture, a physical performance that felt unstable but also deeply compelling. He lived with epilepsy, which affected his life in ways that became impossible to separate from his public image. Bernard Sumner shaped atmosphere. Instead of traditional guitar playing, he focused on restraint. His parts were minimal, but intentional. He used silence and spacing as part of the music itself. Peter Hook redefined the bass guitar in rock music. Instead of playing in the background, his bass lines became melodic leads. They carried emotional weight and often defined the identity of entire songs. His sound sits forward in the mix, creating motion even in minimal arrangements. Stephen Morris brought structure. His drumming was mechanical, precise, and consistent. Instead of chaos, he created repetition. That repetition became hypnotic. Together, the band functioned like a system: emotion, atmosphere, melody, structure, and that balance created something that didn't fit in existing genres anymore. Martin Hannett didn't approach Joy Division like a normal producer. He didn't try to capture what they sounded like live. He built them from the ground up. His philosophy was simple: sound is space. Every instrument was treated as if it existed in a physical environment. Drums weren't close and immediate. They were distant and echoing, like they were bouncing through empty architecture. Bass wasn't just low-end support. It became constant pulse moving through negative space. Guitars weren't dominant riffs. They were fragments of texture, placed carefully rather than played continuously. Even Ian Curtis' voice was positioned in a way that made him feel slightly removed from the listener, not in your face, not fully present, almost like he was coming from somewhere else. This is what made Unknown Pleasure so unusual at the time. Even compared to other post-punk records, it didn't sound like a band in a room. It sounded like a controlled emotional environment. Disorder feels restrained instead of explosive. She Lost Control builds mechanical repetition that feels increasingly unstable. New Dawn Fades uses silence as structure, not absence. By Closer, this approach becomes even more extreme. Everything is stripped down further. The music feels enclosed, almost claustrophobic. Not less emotional, just more internalized. Joy Division no longer sound like they were performing songs. They sound like they were trapped inside them. The reason Joy Division gets connected to goth culture is timing, not identity. When they were active, goth didn't exist as a defined genre. There was no aesthetic label, no cultural movement was structured. Instead, what existed was post-punk. Post-punk wasn't a style, it was a reaction. Punk had exploded, then immediately started to fracture. Some artists moved towards noise, some moved towards pop, some moved towards experimentation. Joy Division moved towards atmosphere. That shift is what made them so important. They weren't trying to be darker, they were just stripping things down further than most bands were willing to go. And in doing so, they ended up creating something colder, more distant, and more emotionally isolated. That sound would become foundational for later gothic rock bands that took atmosphere and turned it into theatrical identity and performance-driven darkness. Bands would explore emotional emptiness, minimal arrangements, and slow atmospheric progression, which pushed post-punk into colder, more experimental territory that helped shape early gothic aesthetics. But Joy Division came before all of them, not as goth, but as one of the emotional foundations goth would later be built on. By the time Joy Division were gaining real momentum, Ian Curtis was already dealing with a level of pressure that extended beyond music. In 1979, he was diagnosed with epilepsy. At first, it was something managed privately, but over time, it became unavoidable. Seizures could happen during performances, rehearsals, or daily life without warning. That unpredictability changed everything. Touring became physically and mentally exhausting. Sleep became inconsistent, stress increased constantly, and performing, which had once been expressive, became complicated and unpredictable. At the same time, Curtis was dealing with marriage, fatherhood, and the rapid rise of the band's attention. There was no separation between personal life and public pressure anymore. Everything overlapped. As Joy Division began working on Closer, the music reflected that internal state more directly. The sound became tighter, heavier, more enclosed. Songs like Isolation and 24 Hours don't feel written for performance in traditional sense. They feel like emotional cycles, thought patterns that repeat without resolution. The closer the band got to completion, the more intense the internal pressure seemed to become. Plans were forming for an American tour. The band was gaining international attention. From outside, everything looked like it was moving forward, but internally, things were collapsing. On May 18th, 1980, Ian Curtis died at the age of 23. Joy Division ended immediately. No continuation, no final performance, no resolution, just silence. What makes this moment so striking is the contrast. A band clearly still building momentum, cut off before it reached its peak, now fading out slowly, ending at full intensity. When Joy Division ended, it didn't feel complete, but in music history, endings often evolve into something else. After Curtis's death, the remaining members formed. Their sound shifted toward electronic and dance music, but the emotional structure of Joy Division remained underneath it. Meanwhile, Joy Division's records began to grow far beyond their original context. Unknown Pleasures and Closer became foundational records for alternative music. Their influence spread across goth, punk revival, and indie and electronic music. Artists didn't just copy them, they absorbed their approach to space, emotion, and restraint. Even their visual identity became iconic, especially the Unknown Pleasures artwork. But their real legacy wasn't visual, it was emotional, detached, heavy, minimal, introspective, a specific emotional language that still shows up in music today. Joy Division existed for only a handful of years. They released very little music, and yet somehow, what they created never really stayed in the past. It kept moving, it kept growing, it kept echoing through everything that came after. Before goth had a name, before the clubs, before the fashion, before the subculture became what we recognize today, there was Joy Division. Not trying to start a movement, not trying to define a genre, just four people making music that felt honest to what they were experiencing. And somehow, that honestly became the blueprint for everything darker that followed. So if you ever wondered why so much alternative music feels heavy or emotional or distant, a lot of that trail leads back here, to Manchester, to post-punk, to Joy Division, and to a sound that still hasn't really stopped influencing music today. And yeah, that's Joy Division. And before you go, I also make music.
Disappear and fall. Please don't leave me alone. Just can't stand the unknown. Carve your face into stone.
If you like that, I'll put a link in the description. Anyway, that one Goth has spoken. Fade to black.